Well, good morning, everybody. Nice to see you're all still sharp and awake. Firstly, I'd like to thank the Royal Canadian Navy and APCSS and the Navy League of Canada for the opportunity to come here and speak with you about a topic I'm particularly passionate, the Indian Ocean region. Interestingly, I had a phone call from Jim Bottilia a few weeks ago. I was holidaying on a place called Kangaroo Island, sitting off South Australia. It was 6 a.m. Now, two things surprising about that. One was that, yes, in Australia we do have an island called Kangaroo Island, however, and it has kangaroos, but also has lots of koala bears. But the second surprising thing, I guess, is that I actually received a cell phone telephone call where I was in a very remote part of my country. And Jim asked me to come and speak on this topic, so I'm very happy to be here and hopefully contribute some useful ideas to this debate today and over the next few days. You'll see from the topic of my talk, I've been invited to focus on the middle powers in the Indian Ocean region primarily, and also to talk about risk and maritime security and how those two things hang together. You'll notice that I am from a place called the Indo-Pacific Governance Research Centre at the University of Adelaide. And of course, in Australia now, the idea of Indo-Pacific has a great deal of traction and currency, I guess understandably, given our strategic geography. But we'll come back to that idea in a few minutes. The big challenge, and I think my colleague, His Excellency Admiral Nirmal Verma, sort of laid it out for us, the big challenge for the Indian Ocean region is how do we develop a sense of regionalism in an area that has no history of that? How do we get the nation states and other actors in the region to start to work together in a common way towards common ends when there is no structure and so on for that to occur? The Indian Ocean region is incredibly complex. So I would propose and contend that a way of approaching this is to come from a risk-based perspective. It's not the only way, and it would be done in concert and conjunction with other international approaches. And I'll just foreshadow that the ideas that I'm about to present, I also presented at the Indian Ocean Naval Symposium hosted and chaired by Australia in Perth earlier this year, in March this year. Interestingly, risk-based approaches are very commonly used in business around the world. Companies run in risk frameworks. Many of you would be familiar with that. And increasingly in government circles as well, particularly in the West, if not so much in other parts of the world. Also in the world of environment and climate change, if you read any of the IPCC reports, International Panel on Climate Change literature, it is redolent with language about risk, about likelihood, consequences, probabilities, and so on. Yet in the world of international relations and international affairs, it really hasn't had the same traction yet. Part of what I'm contending is that maybe that is a way we can start thinking about dealing with the maritime security challenges in the Indian Ocean region, of which there are many that my colleague has already outlined, and creating a non-confrontational way of thinking about the issues that have common and shared resonance for the regional players. So my presentation, I'll be talking about concepts of risk, vulnerability and maritime security, then looking briefly at the Indian Ocean region risk context from a maritime security perspective, and then finally bringing all those together and saying, well, so what for the middle powers in the region? You've already seen an excellent map by Nirmal, so I'll continue through that. There are some 51 Indian Ocean region or rim, littoral and hinterland states, depending on how you count that. And I guess that the big thing that stands out from that is that they're more known for their diversity and disparity than any sense of coherence or cohesion. And that is a major challenge. But I was asked to talk about the middle powers. Well, who are they? Now, I'll leave it to the academic scholars in the audience to debate what is or isn't a middle power, but my list is somewhat similar to Nirmal's. Going from west around the top to east, I would include Pakistan, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Kenya, South Africa, and then as we go further through South Asia and to the eastern side of the Indian Ocean, those countries listed: India, Bangladesh, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Australia. You may or may not agree with that list. You may wish to add or subtract. I put a question mark after India because some literature talks about India as a middle power, but of course, as I think we would all agree, India is an emerging great power and is also clearly the major regional power in the Indian Ocean. So I kind of listed as perhaps both. Very briefly on risk, the International Standard Organization 31000 defines risk as the effect of uncertainty on objectives. Pretty clear, simple, and most of you probably know that very well. And it's pretty easy. However, it assumes that there is an organisation of some kind with objectives. And I'll come back to that for the Indian Ocean region. The second definition I've got there is of vulnerability. There's no single internationally accepted definition of vulnerability that I've been able to find, but the idea of vulnerability is very important when thinking about the Indian Ocean and its maritime security. So I've developed, if you like, a definition that says it's about susceptibility to harm from exposure to risks that pose unquantifiable uncertainty combined with insufficient capacities to prevent, respond or adapt. Now that last sentence is really important in the Indian Ocean, where we have many developing states who are plagued with insufficient capacity to prevent, respond or adapt to the risks that they confront. And while we're on the academic bend, maritime security. There is no internationally accepted definition of maritime security. My good friend and esteemed colleague, Professor Sam Bateman, described it as a particularly wicked problem that besieges all efforts for maritime security cooperation in the Asia-Pacific. So I've decided to come up with my own definition, which I think is very consistent with what our colleagues have already spoken about today. Firstly, I see it as a comprehensive concept that focuses on the systemic nature of the maritime domain. It includes traditional and non-traditional security challenges. It's about collective and cooperative risk mitigation and vulnerability reduction. It involves protecting and promoting national, regional and global vital interests, objectives and core values. And really, it's about protecting issues like state sovereignty, freedom of navigation, economic development, environment and ocean resources, human and social development, and promoting political stability. So, with those definitions in mind, let's move forward. We'll now talk about the risk context, but come back to this idea of risk requiring some kind of an organisation that's at risk. So in my work, I've suggested that we can consider the Indian Ocean region as a virtual organisation that is an open, expansive and inclusive maritime system. Okay, I accept. I'm a naval officer and therefore I think in terms of systems and maritime interconnectivity. A composite oceanic and littoral region in which regional and extra-regional actors have common objectives, interests, shared risks and vulnerabilities. Now, let's very briefly, and I'm going to skate through this fairly quickly, look at what would be the generic Indian Ocean Rim strategic objectives for maritime security. I've identified 15, and I don't intend to go through all of those, but basically the first 5 shown on the screen are about law of the sea, law and order at sea, and economic development. There are another 5 generic objectives that I've identified that are largely about the common need to ensure the integrity of our resources, of energy flows and supplies, offshore oil and gas facilities and the like, of fisheries and the ocean's other resources. I will highlight number 8 on that list, which is about implementing effective measures to address the impacts of climate change, because most of the literature that I'm reading from the IPCC and other areas, other sources, suggests that this will present the major maritime security risk in the medium to longer term in the Indian Ocean region in particular, given its geography and its massive populations that are incredibly vulnerable to issues of climate change. Most of those populations of some 3 billion live within about 100 nautical miles of the sea and will be profoundly affected. Also, I should underscore that the Indian Ocean region is arguably the most disaster-prone region in the world. And finally, the list extends to social law and order at sea, social development, weapons of mass destruction, the need for political stability and order, and the last objective I've underlined there is to do with regional security architecture. There is a need, and I think, again, Admiral Verma and I would furiously agree on this point, to further develop the region's security architecture. In fact, it is almost non-existent at this point, is the reality of it. So we move on then to what are the strategic risks. And again, I'm going to skate through this fairly quickly, given the interest of time. I've identified 19 strategic risks, high-level risks that are generic in this region. The first are to do primarily with sovereignty and law of the sea issues. Freedom of navigation, the need to ensure marine environmental protection, those sorts of issues. The second group continues with the idea of the need to protect environment and resources and the risks to those resources that exist. And again, I'll emphasise that the most profound risk coming down the pike are the implications of sea level rise, sea temperature change, increasing intensity and frequency of extreme weather events, the impact on the vast coastal regions of the IOR, plus the environmental impacts at sea. And the final list, there we are, going down to 19, to do with issues associated with law and order at sea and regional conflict. I'll underline safety at sea being a prime consideration. And I've also underlined number 19 on the list, which is the risks posed regionally because of the lack of Indian Ocean region architecture and entities to facilitate regional maritime security dialogue and cooperation. So if you put that together, and I know that's very busy for you, but basically on the y-axis I've listed the 15 risks, and on the x-axis I've listed the x-axis are the risks and the y-axis is the objectives. The thing that stands out is that regional security architecture is a very large common problem for the whole region. So, in summary, the Indian Ocean Rim maritime security risk mitigation challenges revolve around the fact that regionalism is undeveloped. There's a great deal of diversity and distrust between the various actors in the region. There's lack of capacity and lack of leadership, although countries like India, Australia and others are endeavouring to provide that now. And there is a great deal of risk and vulnerability and a lack of a regional security architecture. So the role of the middle powers in the region is to support the development of the regional security architecture and collective and cooperative security arrangements. Nirmal talked about IORA. Interestingly, it has been largely criticised for being ineffectual so far, although there are efforts currently between a troika primarily comprising India, Australia, Indonesia and South Africa to reinvigorate it and make it a more useful organisation. The word security does not appear in the IORA Charter, so it is not about security. Also, several important Indian states are not involved. There are 20 member states of IORA, but Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, for example, and some others, are not members, and they, I would argue, key players in this region that need to be involved in issues. Interestingly, the IORA Council of Ministers are meeting in Perth as we speak, because Australia is also the chair of IORA at this point. Then we also talked about IONS, the Indian Ocean Naval Symposium. It is also at a nascent stage. It recently had its 4th meeting in Perth. Again, Australia is currently the chair of IONS. But it is really an operational, tactical, doctrinal, if you like, level entity, somewhat similar to the WPNS. Now, with the Western Pacific Naval Symposium, as many of you would know, it started in 1988, and it took a couple of decades, really, before it became an effective organisation, and arguably today, how effective that is. IONS only agreed its charter, its business rules, at the 4th meeting in Perth in March this year. It has a long way to go. I mean, I'm not sort of knocking IONS or putting it down, but I'm suggesting to you that there's a long way to go before entities like IORA and IONS are effective. In the Indian Ocean region, we don't have an East Asia summit where regional leaders, presidents and prime ministers routinely meet for strategic dialogue, as we have in the Western Pacific. We don't have an ADMM+, nor an ARF, nor an APEC, and we don't have a CSCAP, Council for Security Cooperation in the Asia Pacific. So these sort of basic entities that many of us who are Pacific warriors have come to know so well and of course criticise, they don't yet exist in the Indian Ocean. There are different dynamics. There's no ASEAN, there's no web of US bilateral treaties or relationships as there is in the Pacific. And the sub-regional entities like SARC, SADC and so on, I know it's a bit of an acronym soup, are generally weak and mostly don't encompass security either. So what? So in a way, this is a relatively clean slate, and it presents opportunities that the middle powers have to recognise the importance of maritime security. As my colleague Nirmal mentioned, IORA, despite not having security on its charter, is now talking about maritime security, fisheries, and other maritime-related issues as their priority agenda items, I guess, in the lack of other things. There is a need to build cooperative regimes, build capacity, and to also engage the extra-regional powers. Because let's face it, the US, China, France, although they are a regional power, and others, all have an interest in the Indian Ocean region, from both freedom of navigation point of view and trade, but also the prospects of dire human and ecological disasters due to climate change. So in conclusion, in the Indian Ocean region, it's diverse and disparate. The common medium really is the sea. That's the one real thing that holds it all together, I would suggest, and the reliance upon the sea for trade and so on. There is much uncertainty, which equals risk, and there are many vulnerabilities. There are also lack of capability is a big problem, and there is a lack of cooperative and collective security mechanisms, but this can equal an opportunity if we choose to embrace it. The middle powers can play a vital role in this, and India is providing leadership in this way and needs to work with the other middle powers, I would suggest, in a constructive way, which is happening to an extent, but it needs to be much more needs to be done. So the journey has begun in the Indian Ocean. I would contend that it's too slow, too little and too late. And the reality is that crisis management will be the norm, as we've seen with the Asian tsunami, which was, I guess, effective to an extent, and other issues like Cyclone Nargis. I suggest that risk-based approaches offer a methodology for getting these disparate actors together and focus on common and shared risks and issues, and then develop strategies for dealing with them in a cooperative and collective way. And finally, I guess the message for all of you from Canada and who don't live necessarily in our region, the Indian Ocean region, there's plenty for all to do. Thank you.